What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you generally about some of the aspects of black economic empowerment. Firstly, what you need to know. Well, the first thing is that when we employed people to write about black economic empowerment for Business Map, this is researchers rather than journalists, we required them to know about politics, finance, and economics. These are the three things that you need expertise in to cover black economic empowerment properly. All three, okay? But it's changed over time. The elements change. So, in the beginning, and I would say the first phase of black economic empowerment, finance dominated politics and economics. The other two still remain, but finance was very big. And what I'm talking about is black empowerment deals, the big deals. I even had a column for a long time called The Big Deal, which covered specifically black economic empowerment deals. I don't want to speak too much about them now because they're quite complex and can be really boring, actually. And quite tough to cover, but we can do a bit of that depending on time. Where we are now, though, I think, is that the deals are not really center stage, and we're focusing more on regulation at the moment. Okay, so things do evolve, because one of the important points I want to make is that you can't look at BEE ahistorically. In other words, you must know where it's coming from. What are the reasons for it? Okay, let me just go back here. What are the reasons for black empowerment? Well, what's often forgotten is that in 1990, with the unbanning of the ANC and the beginnings of the normalization of South African society and economy that led to the first democratic elections and the ascendancy of the ANC and so forth, before 1990, there was virtually no black business. Black business had been crushed. And I used to go to business meetings in the 80s, and there'd be like one black guy, right? I mean, apartheid was not just exclusionary, it didn't just exclude black business people, it actively prevented them from doing business. And the idea of the apartheid state was blacks could only do business in the homelands. And that was meant like bottle stores, and because there was no manufacturing in the homeland. And all blacks were temporary sojourners, so there was no question of them doing business. So the only black business was really below the radar. There were a few people who overcame that obstacle, people like Motsuenyane, but it was very rare. Okay, anyway, so what I want to tell you then is what BEE is not, okay, because that, as journalists you should know this. BEE is not the same as poverty alleviation. It's not the same as massive redistribution of wealth. It's not the same as corruption. And it's not the same as black business. And I'll go into each of those in turn. And before I do that, you might wonder why I got into writing about black economic empowerment, because I'm white. Okay? And the point is that black economic empowerment is a partnership between white and black. But anyway. So, those shoes over there are BEE shoes. Okay? If you're going to BEE, you've got to have a pair of these shoes. And it's just out of there. Okay. So in South Africa, the poor are kept afloat by grants and other government spending. If you're in the deep rural area, I live in Grahamstown. If I pop into the township and talk to people about BEE, I've tried to get my students to write about BEE at the local level. People are mystified. They say, what are you talking about? Right? Doesn't mean anything to them. Black empowerment has never really been about poverty. From the early days, the idea of black economic empowerment from its early inception was about business. It was about trying to foster black business. Okay? The first few big black empowerment deals with national sorghum breweries in the late 80s, early 90s, which was a government initiative. Actually, the old apartheid government started it, okay? National sorghum breweries was a black business, okay? But it wasn't really black empowerment because it was completely black owned. Anyway, Then there was nail and rail. Okay, now the idea of nail and rail was really that white business would actually give some assets more or less, make available assets to kickstart black business. The same way that English-speaking business helped Afrikaner business grow through allowing Afrikaners to buy a mining company that became Genco. The idea was that white business would allow blacks to start the beginnings of black capitalism. And Motlana, I'll come to him, Ntata Motlana was one of those who grasped that opportunity. But it's still not about poverty alleviation, as you will see if you meet any of the guys with the pointy shoes. It's about malt whiskey and other things, okay? Don't confuse it, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Right, BE is not communism, okay? What do I mean by that? It's not really redistribution of wealth to decrease inequality. Because if that was the case, it wouldn't be as racially based. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that if you wanted, you could take all the white bosses and replace them with black bosses and you'd still have the same inequality, okay? There have been some BE deals which have broad-based measures, and I'll explain that later as well, but really it's not about redistribution of wealth, really. It's about creating black businesses and affirmative action and other things, but it's not about redistribution of wealth, so don't confuse it with that. And I don't even know, the Communist Party is a bit lukewarm about black economic empowerment, by the way. They don't really like it that much either, except that I think Blade might have some deals, but anyway, I don't know. All right, now, let me explain about broad-based, okay, because that's this redistributive element I was talking about. Broad-based deals and narrow-based deals are often contrasted. I put the picture of Cyril up there because he's associated with narrow-based deals, the usual suspects. A narrow-based deal is a deal where a black individual really gets, or a black individual's company, some highly well-known and politically connected person like Cyril Ramaphosa gets a chunk of a company, buys on very favorable terms a chunk of a company, right? So it's narrow-based. Broad-based is when they have a whole lot of small groupings and individuals who benefit from a BE deal. Things like MTN, Sasol, they were what are called retail schemes. You, as a black person, can go and get shares basically at a discount. Sometimes a very good discount, sometimes you can really score. But that's, what happens then is that the people involved, you, me, you know, if you get those shares, after a period of time you're going to sell them. So you get some money out of them. There's some redistribution of wealth, but it doesn't really do anything for the economy or for changing in a really major way the structure of the economy. So it's BE in a sense, but really it's not where the major thrust is, okay? That's a broad-based deal in one sense. Now, because in the early days of black empowerment, people like Cyril, Patrice Motsepe, Toke Sexwale got a lot of these deals. There's a lot of envy about this and a lot of suspicion that black economic empowerment was doing nothing other than creating a small elite. And in a sense, I think some of the early black empowerment was designed exactly to do that. One way of looking at it would be to create a buffer between the poor black people and the rich white people, okay? Another way of looking at it would be that you need black capitalists to drive, you know, to make for a normal society. If you don't have black capitalists, then how can you say, you know, that you have a normal society or anything approaching a normal society? Also, the idea was the black capitalists would build black business, okay? That didn't happen quite the way it should have. In fact, what happened was that black capitalism became about deal making. And a lot of the effort went into financial engineering. So there was a lot of unhappiness about the early narrow-based deals. So there was a lot of stress by Kosatu and other people on getting away from narrow-based empowerment. Okay. Now, government's answer to this was something else entirely. Okay. it said, no, let's forget about this broad-based ownership thing. What we're going to do is we're going to come out with these codes, and we're going to make broad-based mean skills development, employment equity, black management, a whole lot of other things. So there's two ways. So the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, it was passed in 2004, actually, 2003, 2004, is not broad-based in the sense it doesn't actually emphasize widespread ownership. It emphasizes all these other things. So there are two meanings of broad-based, and you have to know that when you're covering it. When government talks about broad-based, it's talking about the 7 elements of the codes of good practice that were introduced in 2007, which is the law. Okay. All right, BE is not black business. That's Ntata Matlana, who said he hated the term black economic empowerment. And remember, he was one of the people who started the first, probably the second, one of the early black empowerment companies called NAIL in 1993, before the elections, in fact. And the other thing about this is that black economic empowerment has had a kind of it hasn't had a great effect on black business entrepreneurship. What I mean by this is that there were some early attempts by black businesses, wholly owned black businesses, or mostly owned black businesses, to take on the kinds of cartels and monopolies that were spoken about earlier. And a good example of that was National NAB, was it National Amalgamated or Breweries or whatever it was called. So the Pepsi bottler was a black-owned enterprise, backed by American money. It came into the country, tried to revive Pepsi, and it was run and owned by black people, and it was destroyed, really, by SA Breweries, or an SA Breweries subsidiary. It was wiped out. SA Breweries was happy to support black empowerment in some ways, but not happy to give any market share to NAB. National Sorghum Breweries, which was started in the 90s, tried to compete with SAB again by selling a clear beer. I forget what it was called. It was quite good, but there were distribution problems. Once again, didn't stand a chance. So the lesson for black people entering into this field was that it was better, in fact, to get a stake in an established white-owned company than try to compete, because you didn't have a chance, okay? So far, anyway. So BE has had a kind of an odd effect on black business. It hasn't really spurred wholly owned black businesses the way it should have. And BE is not corruption. Okay, there's a lot of stories about black empowerment and corruption. But the interesting thing about black empowerment is that if you go to Malaysia or anywhere in the Far East, many places in the world, and you want to invest there, you're going to have to come to some agreement with the locals to part with some of your company or pay some money or something like that. But you don't know what the rules are, and you don't necessarily know who the people are that you should go into business with, right? You've got to guess, and you've got to find, you've got to pay consultants. One of the ways that corruption is often happens is you'll find that the company coming in will employ a consultant, and they'll give them some money and say, make the deal happen, right? We don't want to know how you made the deal happen. Make the deal happen, okay? Now, black economic empowerment applies to everybody, local and foreign, and we know what the rules are. In other words, if you want to do business here, you've got to do business in a certain way. You've got to do certain things for the socio-economic development. You've got to do affirmative action. You've got to do skills development, etc., etc. So in that way, I think it's very good in that it's transparent, okay? But it's still about business, okay? Now, my question is, can business solve all of South Africa's social problems? Remember I said BE is not poverty alleviation. But if you look at the codes of good practice, it asks business to do all sorts of things, and some of them really outside the normal role of business. I mean, you could argue that affirmative action or employment equity is something you should do anyway, right? If you want to survive, you want to grow in a country with a population that's 80% black, well, your staff should reflect your customers and should reflect the society, right? It doesn't seem too out of the way in a business sense. But should you foster enterprises? Is that really part of your core business? Should you have to be forced to do that? Because that's what enterprise development is. So I question, in a way, that broad-based shift that happened when really voluntary black empowerment became very seriously legislative empowerment. There were always rules that required black ownership, but they weren't very clear. The thing about the 2007 codes is it made it all very clear. But I question whether black empowerment can do everything. That's why I say it's not poverty alleviation. You'll see it's written about, there's an assumption that it will solve all our problems with poverty and whatever. It's not going to do that. It's going to racially normalize things. It'll make it much easier for the economy to grow, but in itself, it's not going to solve everything. And yeah, BE is now about regulation. Whatever it used to be, this triple B, by the way, triple BBE is now an industry. It's a whole industry of verification agencies and certificates and compliance. And the other question I have is, running a business is hell of a difficult. Has anybody here ever started or run a small business? Well, listen, before you do it, just think about 3 times, okay? Because it is really, really difficult. And what is more difficult than starting a small business is running a small business successfully and becoming a medium-sized business and going from medium to big, because as you do, your regulation increases. If you go from small to medium, you have to comply with VAT, you have the levies, you've got to report on all sorts of things, and you have to do you have to comply with black economic empowerment rules if you do business with government, right? If you become a big business, well, if you're a big business, you can pay somebody to handle that. You've got the black empowerment department, they'll do all the black empowerment stuff for you. But if you're a medium-sized business, and I've been involved in running one, let me tell you, it's not easy. So I think that one of the real dangers is over-regulation. And that's where I caution that some of the people involved in this space are always calling for more regulation or tighter regulation or whatever. And I just think to myself, do we really need that? Okay, so the big BEE deals are mostly done now. Remember I showed you that slide where I said finance is less of an issue. And in an area particularly of government infrastructure spending, though you see Julius there has cottoned onto this before, tenders are the real big place to make money. Okay? And that's where a lot of your reporting is going to focus now. Now, when it comes to tendering, the new thing is preferential procurement. This is where the stories are going to be, particularly the big stories now. It's going to be about preferential procurement regulations, which have changed recently. What has changed about preferential procurement is that there used to be a 10 to 20% advantage for being black-owned, right? Though black-owned did include white women, which was always a contentious issue. Anyway, the procurement legislation has changed. It now only applies to black people, and there are points for being a black empowerment company. But you'll have also seen recently that there's a lot of unhappiness that there weren't what are called set-asides in the preferential procurement legislation. A set-aside would mean that if you issue a tender, you actually say, like 20% of this must go to a black-owned company. Never mind black economic empowerment, must be black-owned. Right? And this isn't in the legislation. Why is it not in the legislation? Well, first of all, I don't think it's constitutional. But secondly, what Treasury wants to do, and the Treasury controls procurement legislation, is it doesn't want all of us, taxpayers, citizens, doesn't want us to be cheated by people. It wants the best price. It's not a question of cheating. It wants the best price. It still wants competition on price. So even if you're a white company, you're prepared to come in at the very, very, very cheaply, they still want to use you. Which makes it harder to do BEE, but you'll find that companies will still comply with BEE in order to get that little extra edge. Because it's better to comply with BEE than cut your prices to the bone. Okay? So I think that the preferential procurement legislation is okay. But anyway, if you look at the Constitution, it does kind of rule out radical race-based redistribution of wealth. It doesn't rule out affirmative action. It doesn't rule out BEE. It's very carefully worded. You can discriminate, but you can only discriminate to a certain extent. Another problem with BEE is that racial description is now almost, it's voluntary in a sense. You don't have a race registration anymore, okay? How's it, Paul? Hi. So, yeah, one of the, yeah, I think I've come to the end. One of the, you know, you have to ask yourself, how would you actually kind of get rid of inequality in a major way? How would you redistribute wealth in a major way? It's not black economic empowerment, I can tell you. I would say nationalisation would be a way, well, that would be a way of getting to a major redistribution of wealth. And the second one, which only one writer has actually ever cottoned onto, is inflation. We could inflate our way out of the problem, but we're not going to do that. So let's go to questions.